International news now.
Okay, so today we are going to provide an update to our earlier discussion of the Syrian War. And as we noted in the introduction to our class today, there have been at least 5 significant developments over the past couple of weeks. First, assisted by Russian forces, the Syrian government, the Assad government, escalated a new offensive against rebel forces in eastern Ghouta on Sunday, February 19th, so about a week ago. These new waves of attacks, and these were airstrikes, included significant bombing campaign that have killed around 500 civilians and injured another 2,500 people. Now, about 400,000 Syrian civilians are trapped in this area of eastern Ghouta. The Syrian government is trying to retake this territory from rebel forces who have held it for some time. It is the last significant piece of rebel territory close to Damascus, the last piece that's held by rebel forces. And the rebels have used this territory of Ghouta to launch attacks against the Syrian government on the capital, Damascus, right? Okay. Second, these attacks on eastern Ghouta generated a push within the United Nations Security Council last week, demanding a ceasefire so civilians could evacuate the region. And so this was a push based on humanitarian concerns in large part. Russia sought to delay this UN security vote repeatedly until giving way on Saturday when the UN Security Council voted unanimously, including Russia, to demand a 30-day ceasefire from all parties to the war in Syria. The ceasefire would be a durable humanitarian pause, and that's the exact language there, designed to restock emergency aid and evacuate the wounded, because right now they just don't have the resources to really help all those who are casualties of this conflict. Now, the parties did not observe this ceasefire. The Syrian and Russian governments continued to bomb eastern Ghouta. Vladimir Putin did announce that there will be a 5-hour humanitarian pause to the bombing each day from 9 a.m. until 2 p.m. And this is supposed to take effect today, right? Third, there is some evidence that the Syrian government has resumed new chemical weapons attacks as part of this assault. The Syrian American Medical Society tweeted on Sunday that hospitals have reported patients coming into their facilities with exposure to chlorine gas. Now, recall that President Trump launched a limited bombing campaign against the Syrian government in April of 2017, right at the beginning of his tenure in office, for its prior use of chemical weapons against its own population. The Russian government argues that the latest chemical weapons attacks have been launched by the rebels, not the Syrian government. And so there's a disagreement there. Now, fourth, there has been a new escalation of the conflict in Syria between the Syrian government and Turkey in the northwestern region of Afrin. The Syrian government has sent loyal militia groups up to the area to support the Syrian Kurds, or the YPG, in their military campaign against the Turkish army. The Turkish military continues to warn Russia, Syria, and the United States not to support the Syrian Kurds. As has been said, they've said that it will continue its military operations eastern, to keep pushing eastern across the northern part of Syria. So Turkey is drawing a line in the sand on this part of Syria. Fifth, there are new reports that the Trump administration is planning on keeping American troops in Syria indefinitely. And this is a big change in official policy, at least. In December of 2017, Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia sent a letter to Secretaries Mattis and Tillerson, Defense and State, asking for clarification about the administration's policy towards Syria. And Kaine noted that the Russian government had declared military victory over ISIS in December. Similarly, the Iraqi government also declared military victory over ISIS. So State Department officials publicly agreed that ISIS had been defeated in Iraq. And this is a crucial point. If American troops had been inserted into Iraq to defeat ISIS, and now major players are arguing that ISIS had been defeated, then Senator Kaine was essentially asking why there were still American troops in that region. Moreover, Kaine asked the administration to provide a legal basis for the continued deployment of American troops there. So again, remember that Congress has the power to declare war. And the Trump and Obama administrations have relied on the 2001 AUMF from Congress, this declaration from Congress to allow them to insert military troops. That 2001 AUMF targeted Al-Qaeda to justify the war against ISIS, right? So they used a very old AUMF at the time, arguing that ISIS was an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. However, if ISIS has now been defeated, then the 2001 AUMF is arguably no longer valid. So Kaine was also prompted to write this letter because of a December Wall Street Journal article saying that the administration strategy was shifting in Syria. It wanted to retain troops, the Trump administration wanted to retain troops there to deter greater Iranian intervention in Syria and contain the growth of Iranian influence in the broader Middle East. Again, Kaine was suggesting that the administration did not have congressional authorization for what could be a significant strategic shift in U.S. policy towards Syria. And so what Kaine's doing is trying to reassert congressional input into these decisions of military policy. And so we're going to take all of these angles in turn, right? So we've laid out 5. We want to start with a brief summary video of the bombing on eastern Ghouta in the last week and the American and Russian responses to these developments. So let's go ahead and run that clip.
Washington Post Middle East correspondent Louisa Lovelock joins me now by phone from Beirut. Louisa, we're talking about at least 500 people who've been killed in towns just outside Damascus. The Syrian regime, the Russian backers, all insist that this assault is aimed at the rebels. Do you get a sense that this is a new phase in the Syrian civil war?
I think broadly speaking, these past few weeks, we have seen an increase from activity from all the war's major international players. Everyone is scrambling for control to consolidate areas where they have influence. But what's really noticeable about Ghouta, where this latest blitz is happening, is that it's really a place where the civilians don't have an outside power to turn to. They've been besieged for 4 years now, and really the stories we've heard from residents this week are among the worst we've heard during the entire war. Medics are totally overwhelmed. They're working around the clock as hundreds of casualties stream through their doors. And in fact, the area is so under-equipped that doctors say they've been left in a position of having to choose who lives and who dies because they don't have the resources to treat everyone.
Absolutely horrific position to be in, Louisa. You know, the president on Friday called out Russia, Iran, and the Syrian government. He was at a press conference with the Australian Prime Minister. I want to play you what he had to say.
Russia and what Iran and what Syria have done recently is a humanitarian disgrace. I will tell you that. We're there for one reason. We're there to get ISIS and get rid of ISIS and go home. But what those 3 countries have done to people over the last short period of time is a disgrace.
Do you get a sense of where U.S. policy is headed in Syria?
Well, I think the evolving policy that's come out at the end of the Obama administration and now, which is becoming clear under President Trump, is that when it comes to the US, they now have, as President Trump said there, pretty limited goals in this war. They largely involve the country's northeast, where Washington has backed a largely Kurdish force in taking land back from ISIS. So the goals there are to make sure ISIS doesn't come back and to counter Iran's influence. In other parts of the country, however, particularly around Damascus, where this violence we're seeing this week is happening, it's the Syrian government, it's Iran, it's Russia which rule the roost. And while the US is certainly playing a part at the Security Council, they haven't done much in their broader policy to look out for the civilians in this particular part of Syria.
You say that Russia rules a roost here. They're the main backer of Syrian President Bashar Assad. This has been a 7-year conflict here. Does Russia really want to see any sort of ceasefire? What do they want?
I mean, that's not clear tonight. The vote is about to get underway, and while the reasons for the delay aren't entirely clear, one thing that is clear is that it is the Russians who are the obstructive force when it comes to this vote. If they veto today, it will be, I believe, their 10th of the conflict. The veto has often been blamed for, for halting other resolutions which could have diminished the budget. And while Russia doesn't have a particular strategic interest in Ghouta, it's far more of the Syrian government's and Iran's area of influence. They do really want to be in the driving seat when it comes to diplomacy. They want it to stay that way, and what we're seeing play out at the UN Security Council tonight is happening against the backdrop of terrible chaos as everyone battles over this tiny suburb.
Terrible chaos is right, Louisa. Is there anything that gives you hope in this scenario in Syria?
Not much at present. I think that we certainly are coming towards the end of the war, but whether that's 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 10 years, who knows? I think the only certainty we have right now is that civilians in every part of Syria, between every warring group, will continue to be caught in the middle, and many more will die before this war ends.
Louisa Lovelock coming to us from Beirut. Thank you, Louisa.
All right, so a couple of things we want to point out from this clip. First is the discussion about entering a new phase of the war. We have outside powers scrambling for influence in Syria, and they're all trying to consolidate their hold over parts of Syria to enhance their political bargaining leverage in the future. And this includes the United States. The U.S. is an active participant in the struggle. Second, we've got a big humanitarian crisis in eastern Ghouta. Civilians, and what's important to note here is, what's different in this situation is that the civilians in eastern Ghouta don't have a natural external protector. They're essentially a small enclave under siege, and external powers can't get access to protect them. Third, we see Trump being strongly critical of Russia, Syria, and Iran for the bombing campaign against eastern Ghouta. There's a strong statement of American interest there. What we want you to focus on is his statement that the U.S. is only there because of ISIS. Now, the question is that true? Right? Because increasingly it doesn't look to be the case in northern Syria, because the United States is protecting the YPG, frustrating Turkey, and trying to block Iran. Fourth, and we're going to talk about this in a second, is the discussion about Russia actively trying to delay UN Security Council resolutions. They want to maintain an active peacemaking role in the region and shape the larger set of negotiations. And last week, this delay meant trying to get exclusions on the U.S. ceasefire agreement, the UN ceasefire agreement that would have allowed them and the Syrian government to continue to target particular rebel factions in the conflict.
And that's what they're still doing, because they're not abiding by the whole ceasefire. So now we're going to shift to talking about the UN Security Council resolution that was passed on Saturday. And this resolution demanded a 30-day ceasefire in Syria to get humanitarian aid to besieged areas like eastern Ghouta. Sweden and Kuwait initially put forward this resolution on February 9th, so quite some time ago. Russia blocked this vote repeatedly last week and demanded amendments that would allow a number of Syrian rebel groups to continue to be targeted during this ceasefire. So last Saturday, Russia eventually gave way, and the UN Security Council was able to pass this ceasefire resolution with a unanimous 15-0 vote. This vote, though, did not stop the campaign in eastern Ghouta, and Russian and Syrian government forces continued to bomb the area through Monday, yesterday. Vladimir Putin did announce on Monday that there will be a daily 5-hour pause, as we already stated, in the attacks on eastern Ghouta so that civilians can evacuate and new humanitarian aid supplies can be delivered. And so we're going to watch a video about this vote from CBS News, and it includes parts of a speech given by Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, that was highly critical, so you get a sense of how harsh the criticism was. And so let's go ahead and run that clip now.
We want to break in to let you know that the United Nations Security Council has voted to approve a 30-day ceasefire in Syria. It demands that aid workers be allowed into eastern Ghouta, which has been under government siege this week. A new wave of airstrikes today left at least 22 people dead and dozens wounded, raising the death toll now to at least 500, and that does include children. Russia is accused of supporting those strikes. It's not clear if the ceasefire will be honored by the Assad regime or the rebels. Let's listen in to Ambassador Nikki Haley.
Everyone is just waiting to die. Today, the Security Council finally took a step toward addressing these devastating levels of human suffering in Syria. The United States wants nothing more than to see the ceasefire in this resolution implemented immediately across the country. It is critical that the Assad regime and its allies comply with our demand to stop the assault on eastern Ghouta and immediately allow food and medicine to reach everyone who needs it. All of us on this council must do our part to press the Assad regime as hard as we can to comply. But we are late to respond to this crisis, very late. On Wednesday, the Secretary General made an emotional plea for an immediate ceasefire in Syria to allow the very basic necessities to get to the people. Kuwait and Sweden had a version of this resolution ready to go for a vote, but Russia called for a delay. On Thursday, in an effort to stall, Russia called for an open meeting on the humanitarian situation in Syria. At that meeting, 14 members of this council were ready to impose a ceasefire. But Russia obstructed the vote again. And then yesterday, this council sat around for hours, ready to vote, only to have Russia delay it again. Every minute the council waited on Russia, the human suffering grew. Getting to a vote became a moral responsibility for everyone, but not for Russia, not for Syria, not for Iran. I have to ask, why? At least 19 health facilities have been bombed since Sunday. 19. As they dragged out the negotiation, the bombs from Assad's fighter jets continued to fall. In the 3 days it took us to adopt this resolution, how many mothers lost their kids to the bombing and the shelling?
All right, so we're running a little behind on time, so we weren't going to show you the whole speech. We just want to raise a couple of points here. First, we see the U.S. and Haley being highly critical of Russia. She faults them for the delay that then caused significant humanitarian casualties. Second, notice the style of the argument here. This isn't about strategic interests. It's the U.S. ambassador to the UN taking the moral high ground and saying everybody else is on the moral high ground here except Russia and Syria. She says that the Russian delay resulted in the deaths of civilians and children. We intentionally stopped after she mentioned that 19 health facilities or hospitals had been targeted or hit in the bombing campaign. And this raises a larger question because hospitals don't have any military value. It suggests that by raising that, she's suggesting intentionally that the Russians and the Syrians were intentionally bombing civilian targets. Okay. Third, we want to talk briefly about the voting structure on the UN Security Council, and this is important. The Security Council is a powerful committee in the United Nations with jurisdiction over international security issues. Its composition is a legacy, again, of how World War II ended. It has 5 permanent members, the victors at the end of World War II: Russia, the United States, China, the United Kingdom, and France. And it has 10 rotating members. The rotating members now are Bolivia, the Cote d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, Ethiopia, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, the Netherlands, Peru, Poland, and Sweden. Most importantly, each permanent member of the Security Council has more voting power than any of the rotating members. They have veto power over any acts of the Council. So that means to get something through, to pass something to the UN Security Council, all P5 or permanent 5 members must either approve of the measure or abstain. This means that Russia could, on its own, use its institutional power, again, that's a legacy of the 1945 order, to block any ceasefire resolution on its own and to try to get exemptions so the Syrian government could continue to target rebels. Again, Russia had, because of the voting structure of the UN, Russia had the power to delay this ceasefire resolution, and that's what Haley is so frustrated about in that video.
And they can do it all by themselves.
Yep, given the institutional structure there.
Right.
All right, so now we're going to move to another dimension of this conflict, and we're going to talk about the northern theater and the escalation of the conflict between the Syrian government and Turkey over the northwestern region of Afrin. The Syrian government has sent militia groups that are loyal to it to aid the Syrian Kurds in the northwest and fight the Turkish army. So we've got a quick video on that. Let's run it.
Battle lines are being drawn in Afrin between Turkey and the Syrian regime. A month into a Turkish offensive to drive the Kurds out of the area, pro-regime troops have arrived to lend a hand to the People's Protection Units, or the YPG, who control the enclave on the Turkish border. Turkey considers the YPG terrorists and is determined to eliminate them. But at what cost? Political analysts see the move as part of a longer game plan.
Turkey is testing the reactions from the Syrian government, Iran and Russia by targeting pro-Syrian government forces entering Afrin. I think the Turkish president is only temporarily intensifying the situation to gain bigger bargaining chips in future negotiations.
The ongoing fighting has further strained already tense diplomatic relations in the region, leading to worries that it will get much worse before it gets better.
I don't see this winding down. I see this exponentially increasing in terms of a conflict. Do we think that Russians and the Iranians and their allies in the Syrian government are just going to allow Turkey to step in and have a sphere of influence, an area of operation in northern Syria? The regime's position is threatened. So there's no way that they can back off.
Residents in Afrin have mixed feelings about being the new front in the face-off between Turkey and the Syrian government. One thing they do agree on, they're tired of all the fighting.
All right, so a couple points here about this part of the conflict. First, Turkey is testing the Syrian government and the Russians in this military incursion. They want to block, though the Syrian and the Russians want to block Turkey's efforts in northwestern Syria. And so what Turkey's trying to do is get some bargaining chips in the larger political game to secure some influence in post-war Syria. Now you should compare this to earlier comments from the Washington Post reporter on the escalation of external activity in this theater. They're trying to get some leverage, just like all the other major international actors, in the broader conflict in Syria. Second, escalation in this conflict by Turkey is something that Russia and Syria can't really allow. Russia will have to protect Syria in this broader conflict, which means getting tougher with Turkey. They can't really allow a foreign enclave, Russia can't, in the northern area of Syria. This would go against all of Russia's painstaking efforts to secure a friendly regime in that country and its broader Middle East policy. Third, here's a question to think about. What are the costs of continued American troops in Syria if other countries are escalating this conflict? The U.S. could potentially get dragged into this larger conflict, and is that something that the United States is willing to get engaged in? Earlier this month, the United States became engaged with Russian mercenaries in a part of Syria, and U.S. Special Forces were helping to protect a compound held by the YPG, the Syrian Kurds. They called in some drones and airstrikes that killed between 24 and 100 or even more Russian mercenaries. And this direct military conflict between the United States and Russian forces is another escalation that could be quite dangerous. Mercenaries had crossed the line of separation that was agreed to by Russian and American governments. And it's not clear why and not clear whether the Russian military signed off on these attacks.
So what if we go to the map now? If you guys in the back can go to the map, and we'll give you some sense of where this. So these incursion or this strike occurred, or this engagement between Russian military forces occurred right here in what is it, Deir ez-Zor? Is that how you pronounce it, or something like that? And what's interesting here is the Russians and the Americans had essentially constructed a quasi-agreement between them that they wouldn't cross the Euphrates River. The Russian military forces did, or I should say, they're military contractors, right? So these aren't formally part of the Russian military. They crossed the line, and there's a larger conversation now in discussion in the news stories, which is, were they authorized by the Russian government to do this, or did they just do this on their own because there's an oil rig in the area, or are they just doing this for commercial reasons? As we said earlier, the Secretary of Defense has said, basically said, I don't know why they're doing this. There must have been some cross-up. He's trying to de-escalate the situation and to reduce the need on both sides to try and escalate. He's choosing strategic ambiguity so that both sides don't have to commit, and the public pressure on both sides doesn't commit to confront each other in military terms. All right, so let's spend the last few minutes talking about the Tim Kaine letter that we mentioned at the beginning of class. And in December, the senator from Virginia sends a letter to the Defense and Secretary, the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the State, saying, under what conditions can the U.S. continue to have troops in Syria? He's focused on Syria. Why? Because we've got countries declaring military victory over ISIS in Syria. The Russians did it. The Iraqis declared military victory over ISIS in Iraq, and the State Department agreed with the Iraqi government that ISIS had been defeated in Iraq. So if ISIS is defeated, why are we still have troops in Syria? Can you explain this according to your constitutional obligations? He also notes that there was a story in the Wall Street Journal published on December 13th, quoting an unnamed U.S. official saying, our leadership has set an objective not to follow Iran and its proxies, not to allow Iran and its proxies to be able to establish a presence in Syria that can use to threaten our allies in the region. This article also states that the administration is considering whether to make confronting Iran an explicit goal for the more than 2,000 American forces currently in Syria. Kaine asks, if these reports accurately reflect your intentions, the actions you are likely considering far exceed the counter-ISIS mandate and lack of domestic or international legal authority to support the continued presence of U.S. forces absent host nation approval. So Kaine basically then asks, why are we going to have troops in Syria? What's your legal authority to do this? Interestingly, both the Secretary of Defense, or the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Office of the Secretary of State, both justify American troop intervention in Syria according to the 2001 AUMF. Again, this was designed to fight al-Qaeda. And the argument is, and importantly, both the Obama and the Trump administration have made the same sets of arguments, which is that ISIS is an offshoot of al-Qaeda. Congress authorized the fight against al-Qaeda in 2001 because ISIS is an offshoot. The U.S. can continue to fight ISIS under the 2001 AUMF. This is what the Obama administration relied on to put troops into Syria initially. They have an international agreement with Iraq that allows the U.S., essentially Iraq has invited the U.S. government in, and so that's the authority there in terms of international law. But the question is, what about these American troops in Syria? Does the U.S. have authorization to have those, does the president have the authorization to do that if ISIS is defeated? And basically the memos say we're relying on the 2001 AUMF, And we need to prevent ISIS from reconstituting itself in Syria. So we have troops there to prevent the reconstitution of ISIS so they can't come back. And leaves the role of Iran in this larger strategy rather vague. Again, raises big questions about if there is an escalation of the conflict here. So remember, we just talked about how Russian and American military forces became engaged. Does the U.S., has Congress authorized an escalation of the conflict? And if American troops are there, but don't need to be there according to the 2001 AUMF, does their continued presence there raise the risks of American participation in a larger war
And the
in
logic
Syria?
gets more and more strained. I mean, if, under what conditions do you even ever withdraw if you have to stay there to prevent ISIS from reconstituting? That's kind of an open-ended, never-ending commitment that, would be interesting to debate.
Yeah, and interestingly, right here, both the Obama and the Trump administrations have relied on this 2001 AUMF that legal scholars and lawyers and members of Congress have basically said, we don't buy it. Right. What's interesting, though, is what's Congress going to do about it? And they continue to
Well, they don't want to have this debate either, right? I mean, that's not a winning debate for them.
No, and it's right because many of them agree with the need to have American troops in Syria, and yet at the same time, they don't want to have to cast a vote before the 2018 midterm elections authorizing the administration to have troops there. And so it's easier politically for a congressional official to write this letter, hold the administration's feet to the fire. It's another thing to have a vote that then puts members of Congress on the hook for American military action in Syria. The other big question to think about here, relative to the conversation that we started with at the beginning of class, is for all the campaign talk about American withdrawal from these wars around the world, is President Trump actually doing this? Right? And so we've seen American military intervention under Obama in Syria, and it looks like now the American troops are going to stay there so that the U.S. can continue to influence what's going on the ground in Syria. And so is the rhetoric different from the action?
Right, and it's not just campaign rhetoric. He just said, when criticizing Russia, we're there to defeat ISIS, and then we're going to go home.
And that's it.
And that's it. And that's not necessarily the case. So.